All right, so now we're going to discuss the reform movements during the Progressive Era. So let me play the slideshow. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is the People's Party, also known as the Populist Party, and we did discuss this previously during some of the other sections. So the Populist Party can be kind of compared to, because it morphed into the Democratic Party, they had several goals. They wanted to improve the lives of agrarian workers. They also wanted to support the labor movement, and they wanted to weaken big business. When we say big business, we're talking about the tycoons, the actual business tycoons that we discussed, Rockefeller, those guys, and they wanted to increase citizen participation in politics. So like we said, they were absorbed by the Democratic Party, but it ended in 1908. However, what we know is the progressive movement kept these ideas and beliefs alive. So all of these ideas that you see here are part of the populist agenda. And we'll talk more about political parties later. You will also learn more about political parties when you take my class next year for government. So we get into progressivism. I know it sounds like it's a big word and it's kind of, might be scary, right? But progressivism is something that you need to consider because, you can actually compare a lot of what's happening today it's on the same line as progressivism, okay? Progressives are kind of compared to what we know today as like liberals. Not classical liberals, just liberal ideology that we think of as far as what's happening even in 2020. These are people who are just trying to, we'll just say, push different agendas based on the climate, okay? So most progressives at this point are from urban areas. So during this time, they were mostly from urban areas. They mostly lived in the Northeast. They were educated, middle class, and Protestant. And when you think of Protestantism, we're talking Baptist, we're talking Methodist. Sorry, I had a brain moment. We're talking Methodist, okay? Now, it's different than Catholicism. So that just, a Roman Catholic or a Catholic is different than a Protestant. They have different theological beliefs. We had 3 progressive presidents that we think of. They were Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. They all believed that capitalism, which is the economic system that we kind of function under in the United States, they believed it was morally wrong, and they also believed that social Darwinism was morally wrong. And if you've forgotten what social Darwinism is, you need to go back and refer to the previous section, okay? They believed that people could improve their lives and that the government should help. This is also along the ideas of socialism. Socialism, it just means that the government will redistribute wealth or redistribute money from the taxpayers to give it to other people. Something that you can compare to today, Bernie Sanders in the 2020, his run for president, which has ended, he wanted, obviously, the push for free college, free healthcare, things like that. That is called socialism. You are redistributing money from the American citizens, the American taxpayers, and giving it to other people. So when we discuss this, we'll get more into it when you take my government class, but just know that socialism is redistributing wealth. So next we'll discuss political reform. This is how they wanted to reform politics during this time. And again, reform means change. Okay, so they wanted to change local, state, and federal reform. Local reform is kind of like your city, okay? State reform is obviously your state. And federal reform is the actual federal government that we think of when we consider the president, Supreme Court, and the House and Senate. They believed that citizens should have more power, as far as more power in their government. They came up with, they wanted initiatives, which where citizens could suggest laws, which you can, well, yes, you can do. Every time, or if you want to suggest a law, all you have to do is call your local representative, whether it's, for the state or the federal level, and you can let him know or her know things that you think are or need to be changed. Okay. And then they could draft a bill, which could eventually get into the House or the Senate and possibly be passed into law. We have also what are known as referendums. This is where citizens could vote on these initiatives. Okay. One of the things that I highly suggest you do is look into your local city council. We actually just had a vote on that yesterday. But your local city council is the first place that you go when you want to access the government and how it affects you directly. Okay. The city council passes referendums. They pass different local laws that will affect your city. So that affects you before any of this other stuff does. They also talked about a recall vote where citizens could hold re-election to vote out public officials they believed were ineffective. And we also include a primary system where citizens can choose candidates for public office instead of political machines choosing, which is what we also have today. We have a primaries. We call them the primaries, and that's where we have several people who are trying to run for one specific party, and then people will then vote on that person, and then that is the, it goes into account of who's going to actually receive the nomination for that political party. The two major parties that we have in the United States are Democrat and Republican. And the primaries, that has everything to do with the governor. It has everything to do with the president. And obviously the House and the Senate. So you really need to be aware of your local and your state level government, because honestly, those are the ones that affect you before the federal level does. And then when you get into my class, obviously we'll talk about more of the federal government. The 17th Amendment was passed in 1913, and this is where citizens could directly vote for U.S. senators. The reason this is very important is because up until this point, state legislatures were the only ones who could actually select the U.S. senators. Now, after the passage of the 17th Amendment, the people will directly vote. So whenever there is an election, senators serve for 6 years in Congress. So whenever there is an election year where some senators are up for re-election, sometimes it will be the midterms, and then also sometimes it will be during a presidential election, which is every 4 years. That means that some of these senators will be up for re-election. You will actually go physically cast a ballot and vote for who you want to be your senator. The two senators that we have right now for the state of Alabama are Richard Shelby and Doug Jones. And Richard Shelby actually has his office based in Tuscaloosa. So you need to pay attention again to who these people are, because they're the ones representing your state. Another thing that we discussed, or that we will discuss during this section of this chapter, is labor reform. So labor is obviously when you go to work, okay? And they're trying to change how people work. So we have the National Child Labor Committee in 1904. During this time, this committee's job was to investigate the dangers of children working. So one of the things that you need to know is that during this time period in the early 1900s, there were no such thing as child labor laws until we get to this point. So that means that children up to 5 years old could actually be working in factories. And I don't know if you have any siblings who are 5 or 6 years old, or even, 8 years old. They don't really do well when you give them any kind of instructions like that. I don't think that I would actually trust a 5-year-old to work in a factory with dangerous equipment. Typically, we try to keep those kids away from that kind of stuff. Okay. So if you can imagine your younger brother or sister trying to work in a very crowded, loud, hot factory with machinery, it's kind of scary. So child labor laws were created that set minimum age restrictions. So that means they decided, okay, you can't work if you're under this age. They also restricted jobs that these children could do. Labor laws were created for women also that set higher minimum wage, but at this point in time in the early 1900s, it was still lower than men. They also determined the maximum hours that you could work. Now, these two pictures at the bottom, these are examples of children who actually got injured while they were working. They don't look that young, but these are actually, probably I would say maybe he's 11, okay? And he also looks like he maybe be 10 or 12. They look young, okay? So this person, Frank Weigel, lost 2 fingers when his hand was caught in a machine. This was 1916. And this young man, Henry McShane, had his left arm pulled off by a machine, and his right leg was broken near the kneecap after being caught on a machine belt. He nor his family received any compensation, and he went back to work after he healed. So that just goes to show you how hard it was during this time period. There was no such thing as workers' comp. If you know what workers' compensation is, if you were injured on the job, the business will actually pay your hospital bills. But they didn't have this at this point. Okay, so it's kind of scary, right? Again, with labor reform. So after 1900, more women began to work in offices, stores, and as teachers. You also see an increase of women with a high school diploma. Because at this point, and even until the mid to late 1900s, a lot of women will actually, and even men too, will drop out of school to take care of the family. So, for example, my grandmother, she dropped out of school when she was 13 because she was the oldest in the family, and she had to start and get a job to make sure that her siblings could afford certain things because the family just had no money. Most of these people without a diploma were domestic workers, many African Americans and immigrants. They did not have the same education opportunities as white women. Business owners had to complete worksite inspections. So this is something that was new. They had to make sure that your business met certain standards. So many of you, if you have a job now, let's say that you work in a fast food restaurant or some sort of restaurant, you understand that at some point you are going to get audited, and they will come and check to make sure that you don't have any bugs, that you don't have, just dirty workspace, and you will also get a health rating based on that. So those are an example of inspections, worksite inspections. At this point, they also start to receive workers' comp for injuries. And families would then receive compensation for deaths because, unfortunately, some people did get killed while they were at work. Now, another big thing that happened during the progressive movement was the conservation movement, where they wanted to preserve natural land or the natural environment. So when the industrialization time, or when the industrialization movement started to happen, obviously businesses wanted to create more factories. They wanted to create more things. And what happens is that causes environmental damage. You've got a lot of smoke. You've got a lot of pollution. So businesses thought they could do what they wanted with the land. Now, we have a man named John Muir who led environmentalists who said that humans should make as little impact on the earth and the environment as possible. So if you kind of think about, we even have this movement today where a lot of people will push and they talk about climate change and the damaging effects that humans will, add to the climate. They try to say the ice caps are melting, things like that. So this is one of a definition that you need to know. Conservationists, they believe that nature should be protected but also used responsibly. Theodore Roosevelt, the president during the time, also was a big conservationist. That's one of the things that he was known for. And you may have a test question on this. He introduces the federal legislation that protects the environment. And we see several state or national parks that are created during his presidency. Now you have several assignments on muckrakers or muckrakers. So the whole job of a muckraker is to report published stories about injustices. So in 1902, Lincoln Steffens wrote about corrupt public officials and business owners in St. Louis, Missouri, and it was known as the shame of the cities. So he's one of your, notable muckrakers. Excuse me. Between 1902 and 1904, another notable muckraker is Ida Tarbell. She wrote about John Rockefeller's questionable business practices, and it was known as the History of the Standard Oil Company. They then conducted research to uncover how he created a monopoly. Now, again, this is a picture of the Crusaders. The Crusaders, if you look into your world history classes, they were typically Christian, but they were trying to rewrite the wrongs of history. They thought they were doing a good job, but there's a lot of negative things we can say about the Crusaders. Not important right now. You can always Google this, okay? Again, with muckrakers, we have John Spargo, wrote about the horrors of child labor in The Bitter Cry of the Children. This is John Spargo. William Hard wrote about the dangerous steel factories in making steel and killing men. Jacob Riis is also very important because he actually started to photograph and write about the urban poor and how they lived in unsanitary conditions. And this really opened the eyes to the general public of how bad it was in these urban areas. It was known as How the Other Half Lives. And there was a lot of reform efforts that came about after this was published. Now, this is a notable work. You will read about, there's several excerpts that you'll have to read about for some of your your assignments this week. For The Jungle. In 1906, author Upton Sinclair wrote about the horrible treatment of the workers in the meatpacking industry. It's kind of disturbing. Okay, I'm just going to be honest. It's kind of gross, but this is history. Okay, so in the meatpacking industry, we're talking about how do they get the meat from the animal to the public, right? So they have to cut up the animal. It was very dangerous at this point in time. Mostly the immigrant workers who worked in these factories, they would end up losing fingers, limbs. They became infected by diseases. They worked long hours in inhumane conditions. And I'm just going to be honest, these fingers and limbs sometimes would actually end up in the meat. Okay? So this is the long line to get paid at a meatpacking house in 1908. And this is author Upton Sinclair. So you will actually read about, I think there's several excerpts from some of his work from The Jungle, and you will answer some questions about that. Continuing with The Jungle. I know this is gross, so just let's get through it, okay? Instead, so what happened when The Jungle was published? Americans were outraged over food sanitation. Keep in mind, this is stuff that's going to go on your kitchen table, and you will eventually ingest it, which means you're going to eat it. So what happened, they figured out there was spoiled meat covered in chemicals or made into sausage. This is an example, a picture of stuffing sausage in a meat packing house in 1893. So if you've ever looked into how sausage is created, I'll let you Google that yourself, okay? And I'm not trying to make anybody a vegetarian or a vegan. I'm, proud meat lover here. This is a picture of head cheese. Another thing, this is different parts ground into head cheese. So that means kind of like if you've ever looked into what makes a hot dog. A hot dog is typically the leftover, the scraps that they kind of grind down into this mixture, and it's put into a casing kind of like this, and that's, how it's made. Now, obviously, I still love hot dogs, but some people are disturbed by how it's made, and I understand. Another thing that happened during this time in the factories, you had rats that climbed on food and left excrement or poo on the food. And so within months of publication of The Jungle, Congress passes the Meat Inspection Act, and they form the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. Now, one of the things that you can do is you can look up the FDA. They have a website. And there are certain things even now that you need to know. So, for example, whenever there comes out a news story that says, We have a outbreak of E. coli possibly ruining this group of food that was produced here. That usually comes with the FDA. They're trying to announce it to make sure the public is not harmed. They also will look at, medicine. They look at makeup, makeup, shampoo, conditioner, anything that, that you put on your body or that you will ingest. The FDA will have a hand in that. I hate to say this too, but in factories, right, there's no way that you can actually keep out all bugs. You can do your best, okay? Think about a big, huge factory and they're producing all of this stuff. You can keep out some bugs, you can spray, but there's no way that they're going to keep out every single spider, every single something, right? There is an allowed amount of bugs that are legally allowed to be in food items. So I'll let you look that up. I'm not gonna scare you too bad, but I'll let you look that up. Women's suffrage. Now, this is something that everybody gets confused about. Suffrage is not about suffering. Suffrage is the right to vote. So this is now how we get to the point of how women became or got the right to vote. It saw initial success in Wyoming in 1869 and Utah in 1870 because up until this point, it was a statewide issue. It was not something that the national government touched. So in 1869, women were allowed to vote, and same in Utah in 1870. But then after that, the progress seemed to stop there. In 1890, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, was formed. And two famous women that we look at towards the women's suffrage movement were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And you've probably seen her picture on one of those, I think it's one of the gold dollars, okay? At this point, then it says other states gave women the right to vote in late 1800s and the early 1900s. However, the federal government would not intervene and make it a nationwide law that women could vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment, which was in 1920. We also have what is known... Oh, let me go back real quick. I just want to make this point. At this point in time, okay, when we talk about women's suffrage, Native American women could still not vote, okay? All right, so African American segregation. So something you need to know about, especially considering we are from Alabama. We live in Alabama. So this directly affected, Southerners during this time. Southern states passed laws that discriminated against African Americans and reestablished white supremacy. And like I just wanted to point out, a lot of these states passing these laws, again, if you consider what we talked about in the previous sections, majority of these states, if not all of them, were Democrat-controlled states. Because, remember, we talked about how the Democrats were actually the ones who supported slavery. They also supported Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws stripped away constitutional rights. Jim Crow also required separation of whites from African Americans in public places. This is where you would see, again, the pictures here of a separate drinking fountain. It says right here, sign in South Carolina advertising colored cabins in 1938. And this is something that you need to know about because even during this time, let's say that you decided to take a road trip to another state, right? If you took a road trip to another state, you might not be able to find a hotel that was for African Americans because at this point, it was not equal. Everything was separate. Separate but equal treatment. This is the idea that if African American facilities were not equal to whites, okay, so everything was okay as long as they were equal. However, we know that to not to be true. I told you that one of the things that you should do if you've not been there already is the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, Alabama. One of the things that they feature in the museum is they actually look at a white schoolhouse, which is kind of like from a suburban area. And they also look at an African American school, kind of the way that they were set up with the different resources. And what you notice that in the African American school, you've got kind of older stuff. You've got older textbooks. It's not nice. Okay. and you've got the deaths that are just kind of, barely making it there. So this was reality for African Americans during the Jim Crow era. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson. This was a major Supreme Court case that affected the Jim Crow era, and this did not get overturned until the Civil Rights Movement with the passage of Brown versus Board of Education. We talk about Brown versus Board in my government class, and we will also mention it here when we get into the Civil Rights Movement. So, Homer Plessy, it was 1/8 African. He passed as a white man. Okay, in June 7th of 1982, bought a first-class ticket on the rail line in New Orleans, and he sat in a whites-only car. He refused to get up and was arrested because I guess they had figured out that he was actually an African man. On May 10th in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation was actually constitutional, which we know today it's not, and legal segregation remained until 1965. This is an example of a streetcar stop seat from New Orleans. Now, I also want to say that during this time, if you had some biracial men and women, what they would tend to do is they would try to hide their identities because they wanted to pass as white. It's because they did not want to get, arrested or things like that. So it was very unfortunate. And like I said, this does not get overturned until we see Brown versus Board of Education during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Okay, another thing that eventually happens is that the 15th Amendment, this gave African Americans the right to vote. However, what we see is that in these Democrat-controlled states, the Jim Crow states, Southern states started to use different things that would prevent African Americans from voting. So it was just an extra thing to try to prevent them from going there. So even though they did have the right to vote according to the federal government, the states tried to implement what were known as literacy tests and even poll taxes to prevent African Americans from voting. Well, this is illegal, okay, heavily illegal, but at this point it was not challenged. And if it's not challenged, it's not overturned. Literacy test, you will actually have an example of a literacy test in your assignments. And a poll tax is where you would actually have to go pay money to cast a ballot, which we know that that's illegal. In the Constitution, it says that you have a right to vote. Whites during this time also harassed African Americans, trying to make them too afraid to vote. So if you look in the previous sections we discussed, some of these people who supported the Democrats during that time and who supported Jim Crow would actually show up at the polls or show up in the town and try to intimidate African Americans. That way they would not vote. They also might try to threaten their jobs and things like that. All right, social etiquette. Whites at this point in time could not shake hands with African Americans because they were not seen as equals. African Americans were expected to move off sidewalk if a white person walked by. I know this is crazy that you think about this stuff now, but it did happen in history back during that time. The fact that, this one right here, African American men expected to remove hats from whites. Whenever you kneel or whenever you remove your hat, it's like you're showing a sign of respect, I guess, but kneeling is different. We'll get to that later. But when you move your hat, sometimes if you go to church or if they're praying or something like that during a basketball game or a football game, and you remove your hat because it's the respectful thing to do, that this point they were trying to say that African men were looked at as less than whites, and we know that's not true. Okay, but this is just during the Jim Crow era in the South. This is things that would happen, and if you have any. It's probably not going to be your grandparents, but maybe your great grandparents. Now, my grandfather, he's 86, so this was during his lifetime. He's seen this. He understands. But you, since y'all are a little bit younger, I would probably look at maybe your great grandparents to ask them about Jim Crow, because they were probably alive during the 1960s and 70s. And they were able to actually see how this played out, okay? So we also have the Ku Klux Klan. This was in 1865. They were responsible for over 1,400 African American deaths between 1882 and 1892. This is a terrorist organization, okay? These are active terrorists. Terror groups are people that try to disrupt how do I say this? They try to put fear. They will kill. They will hurt. They will, things like that. I also recommend, if you've not been there, the African American History Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. They actually have a very a sad but important memorial that you will need to look at for African Americans who were actually lynched during this time period. And so it's just a memorial to those people who lost their lives. So this is a picture of the Ku Klux Klan in their costumes, standing in front of a plane with Nazi swastika on the tail in 1922. So if that tells you anything, they align themselves with the ideas of Nazis. Okay, we also know that Nazis are a very, during this time they were pretty much a terrorist group as well, but we'll get to that later. Oh, I'm sorry. Activity lasted well into the 20th century, and what I want you to know is the KKK is not dead, okay? This still exists. One of the movies that I highly recommend you watching because it's just amazing. I don't know if any of you have, Denzel Washington, obviously, but his son. The movie is called Black Klansman, and it talks about an African-American man who actually accidentally joins the Ku Klux Klan and sends his white friend, a police officer, to go to the meetings and things like that, but they actually find out information about this Klan, and I don't want to spoil it for you, but the movie is called Black Klansman, so I highly recommend you watch it. It's a true story, by the way. All right, influential African Americans. So, Booker T. Washington, he is a person from African American history that we look at very highly. I thought he was brilliant. He was an African American man. He became educated. He looked at African Americans. He thought that they should be productive members of society, and then whites would see them as equals. This is what he believed. He was also formerly enslaved, so that means he did, serve as a slave at one point. He graduated from the Hampton Agricultural Institute in 1875, and he ran and opened the Tuskegee Institute, which you know about Tuskegee because it's still in operation. He reassured whites that the school would not affect white supremacy. I don't know why that would matter, but so the Tuskegee Institute was an agricultural school, which means that Washington thought African Americans could improve their economic status through farming and other vocational or trade jobs. So if you look here, this is a picture, the wood workshop at the Tuskegee Institute in 1902. One of the things that you also need to know about the Tuskegee Institute is that most of the buildings, like the really super old buildings that are still around on the college campus today, were actually built by some of the students. So that's some of the things that they had to do for their classes. So they actually built those buildings that are still on campus today. They're very old. I'm all about historical preservation, so those should still be there. I think the college does what they can to keep them up. So, another part to this is that Washington urged African Americans to accept discrimination until they achieved economic success. In 1895, we have the passage of the Atlanta Compromise. This is where they decided African Americans should accept segregation as long as whites allowed them educational opportunities, economic progress, and justice in the courts, which that's, not, I'll keep my opinions to myself. We don't want segregation. Segregation is not okay. It's not equality. If you're segregated, it's not equal, okay? In 1906, he was invited to the White House by President Roosevelt, and he served as a racial advisor. And this is a picture here. Booker T. Washington and President Roosevelt at Tuskegee, Alabama in 1906. So Roosevelt came down to see the college campus. Now, someone who was also notable, however, he did not agree with Booker T. Washington, was W.E.B. Du Bois. So Du Bois urged African Americans to demand equality, and he believed that they were not just suited for vocational jobs, which I agree with that. If you want to be a lawyer, go be a lawyer. It doesn't mean that you have to be a mechanic, okay? However, I'll argue that in 2020, a lot of people, and I'm not saying this is African American only, I'm saying white or African American. A lot of people nowadays, you don't have to have a college degree to go out and make the same money. Trade schools are actually on the rise. Many of you, if you know about like the Mercedes plant in Tuscaloosa, you actually can make very good money there, okay? So college is not for everybody. However, during this time, college was a huge deal because African Americans typically were not given that opportunity. So I understand. I think this is where I differed with Booker T. Washington. I actually agreed more with W.E.B. Du Bois. He also wanted African Americans to receive traditional education and have the same jobs as whites. During this time period, like we said, African Americans were not going to what we call regular school. It was not a regular public education. What they were doing is actually, again, it was just more of trade and farming, okay? So it's not like you were getting your math, English, your science, and your reading, your social studies. They didn't have the same, subjects that were being taught. It was mostly, again, farming or trade jobs. He wrote an article called The Souls of Black Folk, and in that article he attacked Booker T. Washington views. And in 1905 we have what is known as the Niagara Movement, called for an end to all forms of discrimination. However, we know that that's not going to happen, not for the most part legally, until even late into the 1970s. All right. Influential African Americans, again, we have in 1909, the NAACP is formed, and this is an organization that's going to be very important during the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Movement. This is in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This organization fought for equality of all races, but also wanted to improve the self-image of African Americans. It was very important during this time. It still exists today. They also believe that African Americans should stop accepting a lower position in American society. That if you truly want to be accepted as equal, you need to see yourself as equal and stop looking at yourself as less than. So The Crisis, this is an article included, or I think this was a magazine, included stories glorifying African American culture and achievements. And this is an NAACP meeting in Atlanta, Georgia in 1920. There was also racial discrimination in the West, and this was not just African American workers. This was also Chinese Americans and Mexican immigrants. Chinese immigrants and Mexican immigrants. So what happens is we have the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, and it continues until 1943. And what this is, it basically limits or makes it non-existent for Chinese people coming from China to try to come to the United States. So they say, no, we're not accepting any Chinese immigrants at this time, and it lasts until 1943. Oh, excuse me. In 1902, we also have the National Reclamation Act. It gave aid for irrigation projects in the Southwest. And just so you know, irrigation is about bringing water to different areas because they might be really dry or droughts, things like that. Mexicans became the main workforce for agriculture in the Southwest. However, they received low wages and they worked very long hours. Many of these people were forced into debt peonage, which says they forced laborers into slavery until their debts to employers were paid. So that means that if they wanted to, to purchase things, it was almost, we could compare this to, in a way, I'm having a brain moment here. We can compare this to a sharecropper. Okay, so this is kind of the same idea, where you work for somebody until your debts are paid off. The U.S. Supreme Court deemed this unconstitutional in 1911 because obviously this is the same thing as slavery. Okay. Oh, that was it. Okay. And then lastly, Native Americans are forced to live on reservations and assimilate into American culture. We talked about reservations. These are basically areas of land where not African Americans, where Native Americans are not able to leave. This is kind of where their home is now. And when we say assimilate, it just means that they have to learn English. They are kind of forced or encouraged to dress in a way that is more Western or American. So like we said, that Native Americans, it was very important, and it was part of their cultural identity and also even their religious identity, because this is part of a religion as well. They did not cut their hair. Males especially did not cut their hair. They wore it very long. But during this time, these people they tried to make them cut their hair to assimilate into American culture, because, think about it, at this point, men did not really wear their hair long. They wore it short. Native American children were expected to attend reservation school, and they had to learn English, and they were to be Americanized, which means they had to learn traditional subjects that you might see. This is a home economics class. Do we have that this year? I can't remember. Anyway, so a home ec class, again, it says Native American girls attending a sewing class at the Albuquerque Indian School. Another picture here, Native American girls wearing their uniform at the Albuquerque Indian School. So again, this is definitely different than what they would be used to. Uniforms, for example, that would not fly. So we'll stop here, and we'll talk more about this in the next unit.